For most of the history of science, it was believed that essentially there were just two states of consciousness, awake and asleep. But now evidence is emerging that it is possible to be asleep and awake simultaneously. Scientists call this an altered state of consciousness. Its effect on our behavior can be profound and disturbing.
This was a dangerous kind of thing, and we didn't think about it carefully enough to know what the problems might be.
When you don't know where you are or who you are or what's really going on around you, and when you're seeing things and hearing things that aren't there, then you're psychotic.
New York, January 1959. Scene of the most daring sleep deprivation experiment ever attempted. Disc jockey Peter Tripp decided to raise money for charity by staying awake for 200 hours, 8 days and nights. If successful, it was to be the longest period of uninterrupted wakefulness ever recorded.
I don't think anyone thought Peter Tripp was going to stay awake more than 2 or 3 days. Have you ever tried to stay awake before an exam for one night? It kills you. Well, 8 days is impossible.
Oh, pardon me. How about you kids? Do you think that might be a hit song? Rosemary June, I'll always be in love with you. We think it's just tremendous.
Inventor of the Top 40 and a pioneer of TV pop shows, Tripp was the most successful DJ in America. His radio station asked a young sleep researcher to supervise the experiment.
I thought that this was certainly a risk. I tried very hard to persuade them not to do it, because I felt certain from my own studies that significant harm could be a consequence.
In 1953, Jolly West had been a young psychiatrist working at a U.S. Air Force base in Texas. He treated a group of American pilots who'd been captured by Chinese communists in the Korean War. The Chinese had tortured the prisoners by preventing them from sleeping.
I felt that some of the Air Force POWs had not recovered their former personality function after they returned. They told me that they weren't themselves.
Aware of the psychological damage suffered by the American airmen, scientists in the late 50s shied away from sleep deprivation experiments. But Peter Tripp was determined to go ahead.
Jolly went to New York and talked with Peter Tripp, and he said, "This is a dangerous thing to do. No one's ever done this before, and you may be in trouble. It may end up that you're going to have physical problems or mental problems. No one knows what's going to happen. Do you still want to do this?" And Peter Tripp said, "Yeah, he's going to do it."
They got back in touch with me again and said, "Mr. Tripp is going ahead with this in any case. Will you be a consultant?" And I thought, well, if he's going to do it, it shouldn't be wasted.
This is one of the most listened to shows around the country. And according to all facts and figures, this is the most listened to, the most popular, the most everything record of the year.
On January 20th, 1959, Tripp launched his attempt to break the world record for sleeplessness. To maximize publicity for the March of Dimes charity, he broadcast his show from a studio in the middle of Times Square.
He was a very cheerful, upbeat guy, and that's what we observed at the very beginning. He called himself Mother's little curly-head boy, and away he went.
He would spin his records not 4 hours a day, but 24 hours a day, and he would chatter and answer his phone calls and do the whole disc jockey's shtick.
I got myself all geared up to use Polaroid films to take a picture of Peter Tripp every hour as long as he stayed awake. Well, it worked.
Good people, right now we're going to kind of close off with something that we think is about as pretty as a record can be. It's instrumental. I think it will be the first big smash hit of 1959.
While New Yorkers listened in their millions, the doctors kept Tripp under constant observation. As the hours mounted, it became harder for them to keep him awake.
When studies of sleep deprivation are done, I always wonder what measures they took to keep the person awake. Because when we studied Peter Tripp, that was our objective, to make absolutely certain that he stayed awake, and we did. I had the graveyard shift. From midnight till 8 o'clock in the morning, I had my eyes focused on that guy, because after 2 or 3 days, you can imagine he wanted to play games, you know. He'd want me to look out the window at something while he'd catnap a few seconds. We never did do that. We wouldn't let him do this. He would say, now I'll just go to the bathroom a few minutes, and it'll be on. We said, we're going to go to the bathroom with you. Oh, he was mad and incensed, but finally we said, look, if you got the bathroom to sit down, you're going to go to sleep, don't you know? The whole experiment's over. Oh, he said, okay. So as inconvenient and as awkward as it was, we were with this man constantly.
By the third day, Tripp's behavior had begun to change. He was abusing everyone around him, even his barber, who he'd known for years.
Peter began cursing the barber, really being terrible to him and insulting him, and the barber cried. He didn't understand this. He began crying when Peter cursed him, and later he didn't come back.
Tripp was given a full medical examination every day. The first physical change, doctors noted, was a dramatic drop in his body temperature.
Many times he would sit in this warm booth with his overcoat on and his hat pulled down. That was a complete change for Peter Tripp.
His mean body temperature progressively declined over this period of time, and the lower it went, the crazier he got.
Tripp had begun to see things that weren't there. He mistook one of the doctors for an undertaker who'd come to bury him. He ran into the street, terrified.
He bolted out of the door. I chased him. He ran across in heavy traffic and just missed being hurt. I had to tackle him to keep him from being killed by a taxi.
By the fifth day, Tripp began to lose his hold on reality. Dr. West was growing concerned.
He began to have periods of frank hallucinations where he would be hearing voices.
At first, the medical team were puzzled by the hallucinations, but then they made a surprising discovery. When we sleep, we enter a period of REM sleep every 90 minutes. It's during this stage that we dream. Tripp's brainwaves showed that although he was awake, the hallucinations were shadowing the 90-minute cycle of dream sleep.
There was a 90-minute cycle of relative confusion and relative clarity that would ebb and flow. During the time that he would, if he were sleeping, have had REM sleep, those were the times he was most likely to hallucinate. It was as though he were having dreams, some of them with even a nightmarish quality, even though he was awake.
He began seeing spiders in his shoes. And he talked about them, was fearful of this. He actually could see these spiders in his shoes. He'd take off his shoes and look inside them and say, those are spiders. See those spiders in there?
If you're seeing and hearing things that aren't there while you're awake, you're mad. If you're asleep, you're normal and having a dream. So it's the question of whether you're awake or asleep that makes the difference. And in his case, since he wasn't allowed to sleep, it's as though his normal dreaming pattern began to show itself.
But strangely, whenever it was time for Tripp to do his show, the delusions would disappear, and the fluid DJ patter would resurface.
Everything record of the year. Now, this particular song around this whole part of the world was not number one the most times, but it was in the top 10 for a fantastic amount of time, thereby circumventing a lot.
He was clearly psychotic. When you don't know where you are or who you are or what's really going on around you, and when you believe that there are strange and ominous forces at work, and when you're seeing things and hearing things that aren't there, then you're psychotic.
As the 200-hour goal approached, West and Cornelison became increasingly concerned.
On the very last night, he was so far out of it that we were hard-pressed to keep from calling an end to the whole thing. But by that time, we were ourselves pulling for him to make it to the end. And we thought that, hey, we're psychiatrists and physicians. We'll keep this guy going and on his feet, even though he's crazy as a loon.
There Peter was, trying to stay awake when I knew every hour must be miserable for him. I saw his beautiful, pregnant wife sitting there with him, wondering, I hope he can make it, and trying to cheer him on, but I'm sure she was terribly frightened.
He reached the point where he confided that people thought he was Peter Tripp, when really he wasn't. He was an imposter. He was someone else pretending to be Peter Tripp.
On the last evening of the experiment, the team again monitored Tripp's brainwaves. They discovered that he had somehow entered an altered state of consciousness.
Peter Tripp was awake, knew he was awake, and still his sleep record was that of asleep. He was asleep, and yet walking around functioning. Eyes opening, talking with all of us, and he was asleep, which is really remarkable.
On the night of January 28th, Tripp achieved his goal and broke the world record for sleeplessness.
But please, take it easy tonight. Drive carefully. The life you saved might be mine, and I don't want to die yet. I'll see you.
After staying awake for 201 hours, Tripp finally went to bed and slept for 24. When he awoke, the delusions had gone.
At first, he felt that he was unaffected, that he was back to normal, perfectly normal again. But his wife didn't think so. And in fact, their marriage started to go bad after that, and they ended up getting divorced.
The man I saw the first morning that he began this, when he was waving at everybody through the glass windows and smiling and laughing and joking with us, after the 200 hours had become a changed individual.
In the months that followed, Tripp seemed unable to recover his center of gravity. He fought with his boss and lost his job. He ended up as a salesman, drifting from town to town across America. Those that knew him well were convinced that those 8 days without sleep had left him permanently damaged.
We really didn't think about it. We didn't think about it carefully enough to know what the problems might be. This was a dangerous kind of thing, and we did it carefully, but I think if we had thought about it a little more carefully, we would have had some objections to it.
Peter Tripp had taken sleep deprivation to the limit. It was not possible to say what would happen if a person went without sleep for longer than 8 days. It wasn't until 1986 that scientists finally found the answer. In that year, a previously undiagnosed sleep disorder was discovered. those that fell victim to it would never sleep again. In the summer of 1991, Michael Cork seemed to have everything. Happily married, he had a job he loved, teaching music at a Chicago high school. But just after his 40th birthday, he began to have problems sleeping.
I knew he couldn't sleep. My God, I slept with him. I laid with him every night. And he would toss and turn or just lay there. He would wake me up in the middle of the night and yell at me and tell me I was snoring and to turn over. One night he yelled at me and he said we just couldn't sleep together anymore. So I said, fine, I'll go sleep in the living room, which I did. And I slept in the living room for 10 nights. And his sleep wasn't any better. I got him a special type of sleeping pillow. It didn't help.
Cork couldn't find a way to get to sleep. By the time he conducted this school concert, he hadn't slept for over 2 months.
It took so long for him to walk and get up on the podium. I didn't want to help him walk. He needed the dignity, no matter how difficult for him.
He wanted to sleep so bad that, you'd sit there when he says, I've got to sleep. So, okay. And he'd lay down, but,
Within 5 minutes, he'd be right back up again.
He was losing physical vitality. There came the time I would have to shower him and dress him for school. And what it did to his independence and his ego was difficult for us both to handle.
Like Peter Tripp, Cork began to hallucinate. He was losing touch with reality.
It was like his mind had regressed to the past. And things came to a head at Christmas. He didn't know who anybody was. He called my daughter by my name a couple of times. It was almost as if he was living back in the past. And then he commented and he asked my mother where my grandmother was, why my grandmother wasn't at dinner.
I says, what do you mean, Grandma? He says, yeah, Grandma, your mother. He said, where is she? Well, she'd been dead 16 years.
Just after Christmas, Cork was admitted to the University Hospital in Chicago. Doctors weren't sure what was wrong with him. They diagnosed multiple sclerosis, even though insomnia is not a symptom of MS. By now, his condition had deteriorated dramatically.
How long you been here? Yeah. How much?
2 weeks.
Okay. You're a music teacher, right? What do you teach? Instruments? Can you say it? What instrument? What instrument? Clarinet?
He was no longer able to carry on a conversation. You got nods, and you got the occasional yes, and the occasional no, and that was it.
Sometimes Cork appeared to be dozing, but EEG measurements of the electrical activity in his brain showed nothing that could be classified as sleep. By now, he'd gone without sleep for more than 130 days.
When you wake up, do you feel refreshed like you should? You do. You feel good in the morning? Because your EEGs look like you're not sleeping very well.
By the third day, he was not a functioning individual. So after 6 months, no wonder he was in a total catatonic state. He could not eat, he could not speak, he couldn't do anything.
After months of confusion, doctors finally recognized that Cork was suffering from a rare genetic disorder.
It was like a bomb went off. He sat there and said, well, we know what's wrong with your brother. He has something called fatal familial insomnia, and there is no treatment, and there is no cure, and it is genetic, so you need to be tested as soon as possible.
Fatal familial insomnia had been discovered 7 years earlier. Victims of the disease have inherited a mutation which eats away at a region of the brain called the thalamus. Damage to this area destroys the sleep onset mechanisms. It's as though the brain's sleep switch has been jammed in the awake position.
When somebody told me that my brother was dying from an inability to sleep, my first thought, and I'm sure everybody's first thought is, so give him some drugs. Give him something that's going to make him... Hello? We all know, everybody knows that there's all kinds of barbiturates on the market that'll put you to sleep.
In fact, even the most powerful drugs had little effect. Doctors in Italy had given one patient barbiturates in an attempt to help him sleep. The dose had been heavy enough to put the patient into a coma, but it failed to send him to sleep. After 6 months without sleep, Michael Cork was close to death.
I remember that day like it was yesterday. The phone rang, and I said, can I help you? And she said, I'm sorry to tell you this. And that's all I let her say. I said, no, can't be.
And so when he died, I wasn't there. And I went in. I kissed his head the way I always used to. And he finally got to rest. And that was the good part of it. That he could finally sleep. Eternally.
I said to people that my brother died because he didn't sleep for 6 months. And people look at me and say, you're nuts.
Never heard of anything
Never
like
heard
that.
of it. You don't die from lack of sleep. Yes, you do.
Joanne Mosby was tested for the fatal insomnia gene. The tests proved negative. But when she was a child, her natural father left the family home and moved south. She knows it's possible that somewhere she has family for whom time is running out.
There's got to be a genetic link to my father's side of the family, my natural father's side of the family. And we need to find out what that is. There are other children out there. I have half siblings out there somewhere, and they need to be tested.
Around 25 families worldwide have been diagnosed with fatal familial insomnia. There's no known cure, and all those who carry the gene will die. In Part 3, we'll look at another genetically inherited sleep disorder, which, like fatal insomnia, has a devastating effect on its victims. As we fall asleep, we enter a regular cycle. passing through deep sleep to dream sleep and back again. During dream sleep, the brain is more active than when we're awake. But in deep sleep, the mind lies dormant. It's during this deepest stage of sleep that the brain may switch to an altered and potentially dangerous state of consciousness. At the end of the 80s, Toronto was gripped by two unprecedented murder cases. In the first, Ken Parks admitted to killing his mother-in-law. He claimed to have been sleepwalking when he stabbed her repeatedly.
Ken was not the first murderer I had met. I had 2 previous cases. I think that's why they called me.
He cried continuously for several hours during my initial meeting with him. And he just kept saying, I don't know why, I don't know how, I don't know how.
According to the defense, the circumstances surrounding the killing were bizarre in the extreme.
He had a late dinner, I believe, fell asleep on the couch watching a movie, and woke up, or started to move, about 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning. He left the house, left the door open, got into his car, and drove to his in-laws' residence.
Apparently sound asleep, Ken Parks drove 14 miles from his home on the outskirts of Toronto to his in-laws' house. Depending on the route he took, he negotiated between 8 and 12 sets of traffic lights.
He had access to the house. He somehow got in. It was pitch black. They were fast asleep. What happened next, nobody knows.
The defense believed that Parks was confronted by his in-laws. This triggered the kind of frightened and confused reaction often seen when a sleepwalker is disturbed.
The father-in-law was knocked unconscious. It was her kitchen knife that he killed her with. She may have gone to the kitchen and gotten a knife to protect herself. We know they struggled for the knife. At some point, he got the knife and he stabbed her repeatedly and killed her.
Ken left the home, got back into his car, began to drive away. He awoke from something on his way driving his car. He saw the image of his mother-in-law in his mind, looked at his hands. His hands were cut literally to the bone. He understood that there had been a knife in his hands, but he didn't understand or remember how the knife got there. He decided that he'd best go to the police station, which was just around the corner. And that's what he did, and he walked into the police station and said, I think I may have killed 1 or 2 people.
He drove to the police station after the murder and walked in with his hands dripping blood and not even processing pain. He was badly cut, and they had to rush him for emergency surgery to sew his hands back together. You begin to feel this man was not in a completely awake state. You know, you have to know sleep and the things that can go wrong with it before you feel convinced that you can tell the real ones from the phonies. And Ken was a real one.
At his trial, Parks made legal history.
Kenneth Parks walked out of court a free man today, the benefactor of a precedent-setting verdict. It's the first time in Canada a murder suspect has been acquitted on the grounds he was sleepwalking when the crimes were committed.
But is it really possible for someone to drive 14 miles, enter a house, and then kill a person, all in his sleep? Was it possible that Ken Parks had deceived the court? At the time of the killing, Parks had been under a great deal of stress. He had gambling debts, and his business was facing bankruptcy. Dr. Cartwright believes this triggered an extreme form of a sleep disorder called parasomnia.
Parasomnias are common in the young child. Sleepwalking, night terrors, bedwetting, sleep talking. Usually they stop through the teenage years. People under stress can start again, and when they do, it's usually late teens, early 20s, then it can be much more pathological. Then it can be really violent.
Parasomnia is triggered by what scientists call a mixed state of consciousness, the overlapping of wakefulness and sleep.
Parasomnia is a confusional state that exists halfway through very deep sleep and wakefulness. Most people are either awake or asleep, but the people who have parasomnias are in this betwixt and between state. They're stuck somewhere in between.
As we fall asleep, we descend from wakefulness into the deepest stage of sleep.
It's a process that moves us down. We go from awake to stage 1, which is a very light sleep, to 2, which is a moderate sleep, down into fairly deep sleep, which would be stage 3, and then down into very deep sleep, and we're way down in the depths, we're way down in the cellar, in stage 4 sleep.
Parasomnia occurs when stage 4, the deepest form of sleep, is suddenly disturbed.
Most of us, if we're aroused either internally or by a noise outside, just shoot right up the stairs from the down in the cellar right up to full alertness. The person who has the parasomnia gets stopped somewhere in between. The elevator stops. So they're between very deep sleep and wakefulness in this never land. They can be mostly deeply asleep or they can be mostly awake. But in that disordered state of arousal, they'll have the behavioral abnormality.
It's 3 o'clock in the morning, and 5-year-old Carl Smithers is in the deepest stage of sleep. Something has aroused him. He's entered a mixed state of consciousness. During the day, Carl is happy and well-adjusted, but he's banged his head like this every night since he was a baby.
There has been times where he's made himself cry, he's actually cut the top of his head open, but it doesn't seem to stop him.
I just hope that it doesn't damage my son's brain. That is the most frightening thing at the moment.
The Smithers tried padding the wall at the head of Carl's bed with sponge, but it didn't do any good.
He's got out of bed and gone over to the door or to the wardrobe, banging his head. If he knows there's sponge on the wall, he won't do it on the wall, he'll do it on something else. But as soon as we take that sponge off, there he goes again on the wall. The same spot.
As our cameras filmed, Carl's younger brother, Shanahan, began to exhibit the same symptoms. Like most forms of parasomnia, repetitive movement disorder is thought to be genetically inherited.
She's breathing heavy and does not respond to me at all.
This 4-year-old girl is in deep sleep. she was successfully treated by sleep specialists in New York. But in Britain, the disorder is still relatively unknown, and the Smithers have been unable to find a doctor to treat their sons. In the US, different aspects of parasomnia are being studied in sleep laboratories. One common form of the disorder is night terrors. The sleeper awakes suddenly from deep sleep with an inexplicable sense of terror. This man is still in stage 4 sleep. Most sleepwalkers behave in a robotic, trance-like way. But some are capable of carrying out highly complex actions. This patient's eyes are wide open, and he looks as though he's awake. In fact, he's acting out a dream in which he appears to have lost something.
And these individuals are awake enough to perform incredibly complex behaviors, but they're not awake enough to be aware of what they're doing or responsible for what they're doing.
Dr. Mark Mahowald runs a clinic which specializes in the treatment of parasomnia. He's treated hundreds of patients who exhibit violent behavior during sleep. Before they reach him, many are mistakenly diagnosed as having a psychiatric disorder.
We've personally seen a number of individuals who have sustained significant lacerations and fractures due to their dream enacting violent behaviors and their other parasomnia behaviors. The majority of individuals do not have significant psychiatric or psychological problems. The most important determinant of whether someone is going to be a sleepwalker or not is a genetic predisposition.
The behavior can really get complex. It's a complex behavior to walk down the stairs, walk around a set of roller skates on the stairs and not go down and break your neck, but people will do that.
No, I don't need anyone. I don't need anyone. No, I don't need anyone. Well, watch it there. Watch it.
There are extremes of people going outside the house and carrying on behaviors, but those extremes are an everyday experience in a way for a sleep center that sees a lot of parasomnias.
But if parasomniacs really are capable of complex and violent behavior in sleep, exactly how complex and just how violent can this behavior be? Again in Toronto, a little more than a year after the case of Ken Parks, this question was to become a matter of intense debate. In the early hours of one morning in August '89, William Wade was rushed into hospital. Police told doctors that 30 minutes earlier, he'd beaten his wife to death.
I was on call when I was asked to come in and see this man who had smashed his wife's head on the sidewalk.
Wade appeared to be unconscious. Doctors tested him for drugs or signs of head injury, but the tests proved negative.
I think he was deeply asleep. He was just lying, eyes shut, asleep. That's all I could say about him. And I could find no cause for it. I tried to arouse him. I used an old trick that we have of just pushing his finger like that, which is very painful if you push it hard, and if you're not expecting it, you jump very quickly. And he made not the slightest response.
I don't recall waking up or moving until 3 days later, when I found myself in the West Detention Center in a cell being charged with the charge of the death of my wife. I kept thinking, something is drastically wrong here, and eventually the authorities are going to find out that there's no truth in this.
Wade seemed an unlikely murderer. His friends described him as mild-mannered and kind. But when the police delved into his private life, another picture emerged. Throughout their 21-year marriage, Joan Wade had been unfaithful to her husband. On the day she died, she just announced news of her latest affair and her latest plan to leave. Convinced they had found a motive, police charged Wade with first-degree murder.
Bill Wade phoned me. He was in custody, and he was looking for a lawyer to defend him on his criminal charges. What struck me, actually, as most unusual at the time, is when I went to see him for an interview, he couldn't really relate what had happened. Mr. Wade had no memory of what occurred.
Okay? Great, thanks very much. You're more photogenic than all these guys. Well, probably into the...
After he'd arranged bail, Hector called in a leading sleep specialist to examine Wade.
This man was a very meek, nice man. Very polite. Had a job, not only one job, he had 2 jobs because he's very keen on providing for his family.
Wade's attack on his wife seemed out of character. Moldovsky began searching for an explanation.
I had to go through a series of tests. This man got a major mental illness. Was he depressed? Was he schizophrenic? Was there something going on? Was there any evidence that he had a brain disorder? Did he have seizures? Nothing showed up.
By talking to eyewitnesses, the defense pieced together its version of what had happened that night.
Mr. Wade's son came home to the house, I think it was around 2 in the morning, and he heard his father snoring loudly. And the next thing the children heard were screams about 3:15 in the morning, and that was the mother screaming. The children rushed into the bedroom.
The kids went in to see him and stabbing his wife, and they screamed for help.
When the children called out to the father, he didn't acknowledge their presence in the room. He made no response. He showed no emotion towards the children. He wasn't a person who was getting steamed up and stabbing someone. It was a very mechanical action. His wife left the bedroom, went outside of the house, and Mr. Wade followed her outside. And he caught up with her around the sidewalk and the curb of the house, which might have been maybe 10, 20 meters from the front door that they exited. And at that time, Mr. Wade began to bang his wife's head against the curb.
A neighbor came out of the house, had heard the commotion, and had shouted to him, "What are you doing?" And there was just no response. And when they tried to stop him, he just couldn't be stopped.
They banged her head as many as 50 to 60, 70 times, and each one with a steady cadence.
They described him as acting as an automaton. It was as though he were programmed, and he could not be stopped.
He just became exhausted and stopped doing it. And then he went down, he sat on his front porch, and the ambulances arrived at the same time as the police. And the ambulance drivers and the police officers all described Mr. Wade in the same manner, as being completely unresponsive, being dazed, glazed eyes, mechanical in behaviors.
So they put him in the police car, and he promptly fell asleep. Now, if someone was in a high state of emotional distress, you know, I'm going to kill her, you're not going to fall asleep.
To Moldovsky, the trance-like nature of Wade's actions was strong evidence that the killing had taken place during an altered state of consciousness. Several of Wade's immediate family had been elaborate sleepwalkers, and Wade himself had the classic medical history of a parasomniac.
When he was a child, I guess 6, 7, or 8, he would shout and scream, and his parents would tell him to go back to bed. Or he might sleepwalk, and he described strange stories during his teenagers that sometimes he would be so violent, he was very disturbed about this, he actually chained himself to the bed when he went to bed, so he wouldn't jump out and, you know, bruise himself or injure himself.
At trial, the prosecution claimed Wade had murdered his wife in a jealous rage, sparked off by years of infidelity. Defense experts conceded that emotional stress could have triggered the attack.
In these very deep states, something of the mind still is there. That part of him was angry with his wife, very angry, and that might have given the impetus to it. But it is unconscious, very unconscious.
We are always exercising control in our communications. Let's say you take that control mechanism away, and then you have just raw emotion without mind. When you delve into the depths of the brain, you get into an area of the brain that deals with our powerful emotions and experiences. Some people have called it a reptilian type of brain, and as you know, reptiles can be quite vicious when provoked.
Wade was found guilty and sentenced to life imprisonment. Throughout the trial, he insisted he had no memory of killing his wife. This seemed inconceivable, but in fact it was consistent with reliable studies of parasomniacs.
From the moment he became aware of his surroundings, he had absolutely no recollection. And when you speak to people who've been through night terrors or sleepwalking, often they have no awareness. After they've done whatever the act, they might just quietly return to sleep. And when they are awakened the following morning, the person says, "That's not me. I don't remember any of that. Is that right? Did that really happen to me?"
9 years on, Wade is still in prison. He maintains that he slept through the events of that night, and he now believes that he had nothing to do with the murder of his wife.
I don't think that I could sit here in front of you today and make the statements that I have made to you, feeling that I unconsciously somehow caused the death of my wife, the woman whom I loved for over 21 years. The whole thing is absolutely ludicrous. And if I had any feelings of ever harming my wife, I don't think I would have lived this long.
He could never grasp the horror of what he had done. And then you get the remorse, the guilt. And then maybe afterwards you go through a system of denial. And the denial is, I never really did it at all.
As of now, scientists aren't certain why it is that some of us enter this altered state of consciousness, somewhere between waking and sleeping. Nor do they know why it is that we so often feel rage or terror in these states. What is certain is that we've only just begun to explore the mysteries of the sleeping mind.
That was the last in the series of The Secrets of Sleep. Next Thursday at 9 o'clock, Cutting Edge heads for a little R&R at the Health Farm.